A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
They've been wrong about the wars, they've been wrong about jobs, they've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible, Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist, America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible, Deplorable Show. I'm Matt Wingard, the Horrible, Deplorable, and with me, as always, is my very good friend, Doris. Hello, Doris.
Good day, Matt.
So this is the 5th episode of the Horrible, Deplorable Show, and I want to welcome everybody from the Gab community that has found us. We created this podcast originally for the Gab community. That is who we aim it at. We've applied on iTunes, and we're still waiting for approval, but we should be on and available on iTunes soon. We're already on SoundCloud and Stitcher and Pocket Cast, and I'm told a few other places, but I'm still looking into that. Just for a moment, I want to describe what I do on Gab and Twitter. I run a news feed. The idea of the news feed is to give you the news of the day with all of the hoaxing and the clickbaiting and the fake news filtered out. So just the 20 or 30, sometimes if it's a busy news day, 40 news stories that really matter and are important and or interesting in some way or another. So it's kind of like my own version of the Drudge Report, but I do it for folks so that you don't have to look at any of the other news media. The whole point of the news feed that we try to provide on Twitter and on Gab is just to allow you to kind of scan the news, read what you think is interesting, be free of all of the crap, and then move on with your day. And not have to subject yourself to the mainstream media today because it is about 50% useless and another 25 or 30% of just complete hoaxing and fake news. And there's really only 5 to 10% in there that's really news that's important to you or could be important to you. So we try to do that on Gab and Twitter, and I hope you'll follow us on there. If you like these podcasts, I hope that you'll share them with your friends. We need to grow this audience. One correction from the podcast we did last time, I used the term rare earth chemicals, and what I meant to say was rare earth elements. And I want to be clear that I was talking about rare earth elements. Okay, so in the news this week, Project Veritas, which does a great job doing undercover work and has set its sights on the news media in the last year or so, came out with some videos further proving that CNN is a garbage dumpster fire. You will notice if you follow me on Twitter that I will often put up the image of a dumpster fire when talking about CNN because I just think they've gone completely bonkers. So Veritas put out a video showing one of the producers for CNN in Atlanta admitting in private that really wasn't anything to the Russia story, that it's a hoax, something we've been talking about on this podcast for weeks. You know that's true. And they put out a second video this week of Van Jones admitting that it was a nothing burger. That's really only telling those of us on the Trump train what we already knew, but it does begin to educate some of the sheeple out there about the fact that they've had a whole bunch of their time wasted on this story. There's no real evidence of Russia collusion. There isn't going to be any evidence of Russia collusion. And the producer admitted that it was all about ratings for CNN. Their ratings have fallen, so they've sort of seized on the Trump presidency as an opportunity to go very negative on him as a way to boost their ratings.
It just makes you wonder how long these reporters are going to put their reputations on the line in order for their ratings to increase.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. I'm going to talk about why the press is angry as hornets in a minute. This producer also admitted that CEO Zucker had ordered them to get back on Russia when they were off on the Paris climate accords for a couple of days. Enough of that. Time to go back to the Russia hoaxing. So I use a hashtag a lot on Twitter and on Gab. You'll see it. It's the MSM is garbage because it's absolutely true. So much of what they do is beyond yellow journalism. As a former reporter myself, I probably don't hold the journalism community in as high a standard as maybe the average sheeple does. I've seen the sausage made from the inside, and I know how agenda-driven it is. Also in the news this last week, everyone may not have seen this, but I hope you'll draw your attention to it. An FBI agent in the Oregon Refugee Standoff was indicted, probably for lying under oath. You'll remember that during that Oregon Refugee Standoff, Lavoy Finicum was shot dead, ultimately by Oregon State troopers. But it looks like FBI agents or an FBI agent was one of the first to opening fire on him as Lavoy was exiting his truck.
And it just makes you wonder, although I understand the FBI agent's bullets didn't hit Mr. Finicum, it makes you wonder if he hadn't started the shooting, if the rest wouldn't have shot.
I think it's certainly clear by the trigger happiness of the FBI that they intended to shoot somebody. I mean, the attitude, the fact that the FBI is firing on him as he's exiting his truck, and then a few moments later he is shot dead by state troopers who claimed, and you can see in the video he was reaching for something, but we don't really know the dialogue that went on. The point is it shows everybody was kind of hyped up and ready to use their weapons.
Yeah, when you look at the video of that, it's just heartbreaking. You can just see what's going to happen, and it's so wrong.
So for those who have DirecTV, on the Audience channel, which is something that AT&T controls, they funded a documentary called American Standoff, and Doris and I have both seen it. It's truly an amazingly well-done documentary about the whole Oregon standoff. It is basically only currently available exclusively on DirecTV and other AT&T outlets. I'm hoping that eventually it'll end up on Netflix and other broader areas so that most of you who maybe don't have DirecTV can see it. But put this on your list, folks. You need to see this documentary. It's eye-opening and it's educational. It's extremely well done, and you'll never quite look at these issues the same. So Doris had brought up a very good point about why the press losing their credibility. I want to describe why I believe so many of the press have gone completely off the deep end, why they have lost their marbles. And I know folks like Doris look at this and say she can see their credibility evaporating. She's wondering, why aren't they putting on the brakes? Why aren't they doing a course correction simply for their own sake? But I think I can explain this complete insanity for you. We have to go back to the election and remember that first of all, we have to remember a couple of things about how the left-leaning press operates. They love to work as a fifth column for the Democrats. I mean, they're always trying to undermine Republicans. So what they look for is an opportunity to taint all Republicans with what one Republican does. Now, they'll almost never do this to Democrats. Notice with the Anthony Weiner scandal, there's been no attempt by the mainstream press to taint all Democrats with the actions of accessing pornography and having contact with an underage girl that Anthony Weiner was involved in. They treat that as it's his individual problem. It has nothing to do with the Democrats. Tisk, tisk, go away, right? But as soon as a Republican does something, anything equivalent, that becomes an opportunity to tar all Republicans. And you'll remember when Todd Aiken in the previous election cycle had made some really weird comments about women not getting pregnant from rape. Stupid, and it should have ended his campaign, and it was moronic, but there was this attempt to pin his comments on every single Republican. The press loves to help with that. So you have to understand their mindset, first of all, which is they're always looking for an opportunity to gang up on Republicans and paint them with a broad brush based on what one Republican does. So along comes Trump and immediately makes a comment they interpreted as calling all Mexicans rapists. They lied about that. But the point is that they saw him as, okay, here's a guy who's clearly not going to be the nominee, but he's a Todd Aiken-like buffoon. He's going to say these really horrible things, and what we need to do is give him a tremendous amount of exposure so that he will taint the entire Republican field, and whoever ends up coming out of that, we're going to taint him with everything that Trump said, or make him have to waste a whole bunch of time trying to deny it, and that he's wounded and there's no way he's going to be able to beat Hillary. So there was this immediate decision to give Trump, to televise his town halls, his public appearances. Now, did they do that for ratings? Sure, absolutely. I mean, there was a little bit of ratings in there, but it fit well with their objectives too, which they thought this guy's going to, blow himself up, and he's going to blow up the Republican Party with him. And so, as it turned out, they ended up giving him about $2 billion in free advertising because they thought they were giving him the rope to hang himself with.
Just the first time, not the first time Trump outsmarted him.
Of course, he understood their business better than they did, and he built a bandwagon off of those appearances, speaking directly to the American people and speaking in a non-politician way. So people started coming to him, and it's worth remembering that he held the lead in the polling lead in the primary from the beginning. There was one moment when Carson had it for a few days, but otherwise, throughout the primary, he had the polling lead, something the press just simply ignored, pretended was temporary, couldn't last. Remember, he had this ceiling. So they gave him all of this airtime, and he built the base that he needed. By the time they figured out that he really probably was going to win the nomination, they were concerned then that he could win the whole thing. So that's when they stopped running his rallies all the time. The 24/7 coverage of his rallies stopped. Now, I explain all of that because understanding that helps you to understand that the press feels guilty. They thought they were giving this guy the rope to annihilate himself and the Republican Party so that Hillary could become president. Instead, he used them to build the base that ultimately became his nomination and then his victory. So they feel very responsible for creating him. And they're also, within that is a bitterness that not only do they feel responsible, but they thought they were getting one over on him, and he got one over on them in the end, right? So the certified smart people feel like it didn't turn out the way that they wanted. And he's not the dummy that they claim he is, and they're not as smart as they think they are. So this explains why they're mad as hornets, and why now that he's president of the United States, they feel like it's their job to undermine him and to bring him down and to try to end this presidency, because in their minds, he's the creature they created. And that if they hadn't given him all that airtime in the beginning, they believe he wouldn't be president. I don't believe that's true. I think Trump was on to something from the beginning, and social media was giving him access, and he was going to get there. But I'm trying to describe what's going on in their mind. So from their perspective, they put Hitler in office. And so they're absolutely losing their minds over this, and they believe that there just is nothing that they shouldn't do or say, including lying and hoaxing about Russia, whatever it takes. It doesn't matter, because they have to make up for what they did. Now, in this way, I think of them as that guy at the casino who's losing and goes to his bank, his ATM, and withdraws more because he's going to win it back. They haven't figured out that Trump's the casino and that they're the player. So the longer they do this, the more he wins. And now they're selling their credibility. They've gone to the ATM and taken out all of their credibility, and they've come back to the table and they've put that on the line too. And they're going to lose. The casino's going to wipe the table clean with all of their credibility.
All the polls will show you that the press continues to lose credibility with the public, so it's no wonder they're upset.
They're the idiot chasing a casino loss. So now, of course, they're on, that he punches back. They're on this whole diatribe that he's putting the press in danger. Now, they didn't care when their rhetoric was putting Republican congressmen in danger. And those guys have actually been shot. But I think they'll tell you that their rhetoric has nothing to do with inciting violence, and yet they're convinced that his rhetoric will incite violence against them, which tells you a couple of things. One is they understand that this rhetoric that they participate in does ratchet up the emotions out there and can lead unstable people to do violent things. They just don't like having that turned on them. They can dish it out, but they can't take it. The press thinks of themselves as a special class. They read themselves into the Constitution when really I don't read them into the Constitution. The Constitution talks about a free press, but that is a broad statement about how it's all of our rights to publish. It's all of our rights to speak freely to power. It is not in the Constitution that there's a special group of people who get to designate themselves the press and then get special rules applied to them. There is no rule that applies to the press that doesn't apply to all of us in the Constitution. But over time, they have developed this mindset that they are in this elite class. I call them the high priests. You know, in previous civilizations, you had your ruling class and then you had your priestly class, which were the folks who got to interpret all of the omens, and they're the ones who spoke directly to God or the gods, and they told society when to be afraid and when to be happy and when the celebrations were going to take place. The rulers ruled. Priests had control of our culture. In today's much more secular world, the press and Hollywood have really taken on that role of the high priests, of deciding for us when we're to be happy and what we're to be happy about, and when we're to be sad and what we're to be sad about, and what the culture is going to be. And so when you read things about them complaining about journalism today, I always try to read those and substitute the word journalism for high priest, because it's a lot more fun to read when you read it that way, and you can see their mindset, which is that they feel a sense of entitlement, and that we're all supposed to respect them more and pay homage to them and make the sacrifices at the appropriate time when they tell us to. And when we treat them with contempt, well, they lose all their power. You know, rulers throughout history rule through strength. I mean, the reason they're the ruler is because they'll split your head open with a sword or an axe, and the tough man ruled. The priests were much more conniving. Everything that they talked about might be true. The gods might exist or might not, but the point is that they're much more intellectual in that they have to kind of convince us to believe in whatever they're selling. You know, today's omen. We opened up the entrails of the pigeon, and the omen today is good. They have to be very convincing. And that's why there was a lot of theater involved in all of that over the millennium, because it was partly about magic and about convincing people that what they were seeing and feeling was real. When you reject that, when you say, you know, the magician has no clothes, or I can see that that's a collapsible cage, and I know you have a bird in your pocket and there's a card up your sleeve, well, that infuriates a magician, and it infuriates the high priests of the temple of mainstream journalism as well. When you basically say, I know you're hoaxing me, and you're not smarter than I am, and I know that you have an agenda, they freak out. They freak out because it takes away all of their power. Their power is not real, it's ethereal. So that's why they're mad as hornets. I noticed that Ann Coulter and Sean Hannity have gotten into a little spat this week. She's mad because she felt like she was edited out of his show a little. She thinks he's a Trump sycophant. And then today he goes and tweets about the Morning Joe host's facelift, and Ann has this, after like 2 or 3 days of going after Hannity and kind of criticizing Trump, she retweets that tweet and says, "And this is why I love Trump again." It's just beautiful because Ann vacillates back and forth. She's trying to put pressure on the Trump administration to be more conservative. If you follow us on this podcast, you know that I've made the point continuously that Trump is not as conservative as the rest of us. He ran as a nationalist. It's sort of a blend of conservatism and populism. I, for one, knew exactly what I was getting. I'm not expecting the president to be as conservative as I am because I had my eyes wide open about who I was electing. I'm sick and tired of conservative ink that's been telling me what I want to hear and making me think they're on my side and never delivering anything. I said from very early on in Trump's campaign that he'll deliver more victories for conservatives than conservative ink ever did, and he'll do that while not necessarily being the most conservative person we've ever elected. And why? Because he's a fighter. Because he's a fighter, and that's why he puts out the Morning Joe tweets he did today, and you see all the hanky brigade in the Republican Party going to work today, you know, with their perfumed hankies, saying that it's so unpresidential for him to say those things while he continues to deliver, for us. She was criticizing Gary Cohn and the fact that Trump's brought in some folks from Goldman Sachs. I have no problem with that. She's actually right about Gary Cohn. And I have no problem with her continuing to put pressure on Trump to build the wall. I think he needs to, and his administration needs to have constant pressure on them to deliver on that. They have to hear from outside the Beltway because there's no one inside the Beltway who's going to be putting that pressure on him. And he needs to do more on immigration. I saw General Kelly talking about how they have, since Trump signed the executive order on ICE and illegal immigration, that they have arrested 66,000 people. Well, we're about 6 months into the administration, 66,000 arrests. You do the math on that, and if they last 8 years, that's a little over 1 million people arrested and deported by ICE. That needs to increase by a factor of 30 in order to be effective. So while I'm happy that border crossings are down 70%, there are a lot of people that need to be deported. At the rate they're going, claiming that 66,000 is a big deal is not for the time period in question. If the administration only lasts 4 years, that's going to be only 500,000 people deported. So they need to ramp up the deportations, and as I've said before, I'm waiting until the end of the year to draw a full assessment of him on immigration because they need time to ratchet this up, and I want to give them time to get into the full swing of things before I make an evaluation on how they're doing. On healthcare, Anne has been very, very critical of the healthcare plan. I get it. It's not going to be as conservative as I want it to be, but as a car in this line of trains, including tax reform and infrastructure and budget and everything else that needs to happen, a health reform bill must pass. It must pass. And if you're familiar with the Senate and the House, you know there are not enough conservatives to get the kind of bill that Rand Paul would like. I feel like some of Anne's concerns are more self-interest. She complains a lot about the cost of her own health care, and I get that. Healthcare was never really Trump's main issue. Basically, he just said on the road, we're going to repeal and replace Obamacare, and then he would talk about other things. He did say he's not going to leave anybody dying in the streets. Those were part of the ways that I sort of understood from Trump that he wasn't for just a repeal of Obamacare. He's not a libertarian/conservative on this issue. So they need something. They need to make it as conservative as they can, but ultimately they have to pass something. And that means it's probably not going to be a bill that Anne likes. I blame the GOP for this. This is not Trump's fault, although this is his bill, and I refuse this idea that somehow this is not Trump's healthcare bill. Whatever passes and he signs, that's his bill. He and Tom Price have been heavily involved in the negotiations, so this is their bill. But remember that while the GOP was claiming for 8 years that they were for repeal, and most of them were for repeal and replace, so I'm not mad at the GOP for not just repealing Obamacare, because that's not what they've been promising. Most of them every single Republican has run for re-election at some point during the Obama administration, and very few of them said they were for just repeal. So we always knew there was going to be some replacement, and that it meant that it wasn't going to be just what ultra-conservatives would want, which is just a complete repeal of Obamacare. But they've had 8 years to come up with a plan that they were all unified around. And they never did that, okay? And we've talked before about why that is. I think there's a lot of insincerity on the Republican side. I think a lot of them were just mouthing the words repeal and replace, and they really didn't mean it. I think some of them even thought Obamacare was here to stay. That's not Trump's fault. He's not responsible for the fact that the Republican Party never got organized on this. In fact, that's part of why he was so successful last year. So many of us were ready to reject the Republican Party and Conservative Inc. because we know they're not delivering, and they weren't going to deliver. So I'm with Trump. I've been with Trump. He's a nationalist. I understand that on some things he's not as conservative, and I just accept that. For me, as I've said before, the issue is immigration. If we don't solve the immigration issue, we can't win on any other conservative issue because we won't have the votes. So I intend to hold the president's feet to the fire on the issue that he campaigned most prominently on, which was that he's going to radically change our immigration laws and that illegals were going to have to go. And like I said, we'll wait till the end of the year to fully assess how he's doing. But that is the most critical thing because it allows us to fight another day on other issues. If we lose on immigration, we lose forever on everything. And it really just doesn't matter. So I see a guy like Rand Paul out there complaining now. And I have to say, I see that as grandstanding. Even though I may agree with Rand Paul politically on healthcare, the fact that he's making all these comments and criticizing the bill a couple of days or a week before it's supposed to pass in the Senate, that's just him carving out space as this ultra-conservative right before the bill passes. It's not helpful to the process. That's really a lot of, and he's not the only one doing this, but when you see politicians doing this late in the game, they're doing it for their own selfish reasons, to be able to fundraise and to virtue signal that they're still a conservative. But the key is where's Rand Paul in the 2 or 3 years leading up to this vote putting together a coalition, assembling the votes for his plan. That didn't happen. So instead, he just waits until whatever's going to pass is about to pass and then says, by the way, this is not conservative enough, and I'm not even sure I can support it. That's all about him.
Oh, so much easier to complain because you don't have an answer. And obviously the Republicans, and including Rand Paul, didn't have an answer prior to now.
Well, he did have an answer. I'm sure he knows what he wants. But in politics, your job is not just to come with your own bill, but to assemble the votes and to devise a strategy to get something passed. And I never saw Rand Paul or Ted Cruz or these others doing that. And that's what I'm talking about with Conservative Inc. It's not enough for these folks to say, I'm not that moderate conservative, I'm the ultra-conservative. Great, wonderful. But what are you doing to get more ultra-conservatives elected so you have the votes? And what are you doing to formulate a plan to actually deliver? When I was in the legislature, I had my beliefs, but I also understood how to count votes. And, we were in the minority in the beginning, so I didn't really worry about voting no, although I did vote no on most of what the Democrats were doing. I concentrated my time and effort on recruiting, because what needed to happen was we needed more Republicans elected in the legislature. And then once we had the tie, I understood that we only had a tie, and therefore, when we were governing in that session, the Democrats had the Senate, they had the governor's mansion, we simply had a tie in the House. That means we couldn't have everything we wanted, and we couldn't just shut down the government under that. But we could extract some concessions, and I felt like we did extract concessions that were equivalent to our balance of power, which was basically one half of one chamber of the legislature. And we got some pretty significant education reforms passed. I was part of a team, and ultimately we have to compromise in those conversations. But I tell you all of that to simply say that when you're looking at people like Rand Paul, it's not enough for them just to genuflect, and to just say, I'm with you on this issue. They're being paid $200,000 a year. They have the spotlight. The job is about more than just how they vote. They have to be out there creating a movement and creating the votes necessary to actually ultimately pass this agenda. So at the point at which we now have the Senate and we now have the House and we have the President of the United States, now's not the time for people to be putting up their signs and saying, here's what I stand for, and this isn't conservative enough. We're actually in control now, and we have who we have in the House and the Senate. And so we have to pass the bill that we can pass with those votes, because you can't count on the Republicans holding the House in the next election. They may or they may not. But my feeling is you always have to govern today with what you have. And then when you go out, if we can increase our majorities in the House and the Senate and Congress, wonderful. And that means we can come back to these issues and we can make them even more conservative. But simply doing nothing, saying this isn't conservative enough, so we're going to do nothing, and then with the hope that you're going to go out and get a more conservative legislature the next time around, is a huge mistake. It's a missed opportunity, because what if you don't? What if you lose the House? That means Congress got more liberal. And so you missed your high watermark to get the best, most conservative bill you possibly could passed because it wasn't conservative enough. So for me, it's not about being conservative. It's a time and place issue. During campaigns, during recruiting, when you're in the minority, that's when you fight and you expect people to hold the conservative line. But once you actually have power, now's the time to deliver, and you deliver the best possible outcome you can based on the votes that you have. It's your only choice, otherwise you're throwing away an opportunity. So I noticed this in this last week that George Will published an op-ed in the Washington Post that I thought was just basically his white flag op-ed. It was his swan song. It was his total surrender, in which George Will says, I'm an elitist and I'm irrelevant. Please ignore me for the rest of my career. So the title of this op-ed was Conservatism is Soiled by Scowling Primitives. And he goes on to wax about William F. Buckley and how wonderful it was. William F. Buckley enjoyed a nice glass of wine, and he was unapologetic about yachting. Give me a break. Give me a break. I like William F. Buckley as much as the next guy, but that's in the past. And what we're talking about here is what was actually delivered by Buckleyism over 40 or 50 years. An end to the Cold War. That's the one answer I always get, is an end to the Cold War. Okay, I'm actually willing to give him credit for that, even though there's a possibility that the Cold War might have ended anyway. But let's give him credit for that. That was a great accomplishment. Domestically, nothing was achieved. Nothing. The Democrats and the Socialists over the last 100 years had one accomplishment. We wouldn't think much of it. They've accomplished hundreds and thousands of things in the meantime. So the whole party and the base have shifted to a fighting stance. That's why they're interested in people like Trump who fight back, who push back. And they're not interested in this perfumed hanky, redcoat surrendering George Willism. And he knows it. He and his ilk, the Bill Kristols of the world, they know they've been rejected. What's interesting about his op-ed is I read it and I thought, how many people in this country would actually agree with George Will? I can't believe there's more than about 1 million people in this George Will, Bill Kristol constituency. They've been very lucky to be part of a broader coalition, the Republican Party, for which they've been allowed to lead it. But they're on the sidelines now, and left to their own devices, they would have the smallest party in American history. And it's too bad they don't play well with others, but they've been demoted from the leadership position, and that they cannot stand. So good riddance to them. I don't have any energy left to care, and George, Will, and Bill Kristol and the rest can, the Ben Shapiros of the world, they can just float off into the ether. So on that subject, I want to talk a little bit about the unity of the anti-left. There are a lot of different spheres within this broader movement against the left. And it's a broad spectrum. And I get that people's attitudes and the things that they say may be distasteful, or you may openly disagree if you're in another sphere on the anti-left. My argument is that we need to take a page from how the Democrats operate, and that is that when they disagree with something, they make their disagreement very short, and then they pivot to what they want to talk about. So whether it's a Trump tweet or somebody doing a civil disobedience act at the New York theater, if you disagree with it, in my mind, if you are a member of this broad anti-left, if you can stay quiet, just stay quiet. There's no reason to criticize it. You just don't praise it. You know, if that particular action or activity is not something you support, then don't support it. But that doesn't mean you have to participate in condemning it. If you're in a position of power, as some senators are, and they're under a lot of scrutiny, and the press is going to bring them this tweet, they need to simply just try to condemn it as lightly as possible and then move on. I saw that Orrin Hatch was asked about Trump's tweet, and he was like, well, it isn't what I would have said. And then he pivoted and started talking about what he wanted to talk about. That's the right way. When you see people on our so-called our side of the aisle taking to doing a whole speech or a long soliloquy, or they write an op-ed condemning some activity on the anti-left side of the spectrum, that's somebody you know is not with us. That's somebody who's basically in it for themselves, and this is their way of currying favor with elites or with the liberal commanding heights in this country, and maintaining their own salary and their own position. And you can tell just when you're watching people, even the people who you know maybe aren't the biggest Trump fans. And there's lots of people out there who have mixed feelings one way or the other. In my mind, you can tell by just evaluating how they criticize. Do they keep it short and light and move on? Another good example was Paul Ryan said something very similar to, it's not helpful when the president tweets like that, but we're getting a lot done. And then he went on to talk about what they were passing. So the press wants him to do some big condemnation of Trump, and he's basically refusing to do it. It's not that he isn't criticizing, but he's not going out of his way to say something extreme, like, he's a buffoon, or he's being very unpresidential. He just said something along the lines of, that's not helpful, but we can walk and chew gum at the same time, and we're getting lots done. I take that as a good sign. I'm very happy to see Ryan do that, because I know as a politician, they're going to get confronted with this stuff. Somebody at a rally did a Nazi salute. Your job is just to condemn it and move on. But you don't have to go and write, an op-ed in the paper about how we're being taken over by Nazis. We are not being taken over by Nazis, and some idiot doing a Nazi salute somewhere is irrelevant. So actually, most of these people will signal to you whether or not they get it and whether or not they're part of the anti-left movement by how they handle things that they may disagree with within the broader movement. Do they condemn it lightly and then pivot, or do they go out of their way to say, look at me, yes, I will absolutely, in the strongest terms, condemn at this because I am an elitist and I understand that what's going on is just horrible. If they take that tact, Ben Sass, then you know they're not with us, and I would invite people in the great state of Nebraska to help us rid ourselves of this elitist. I want to talk for a few minutes about the elites in this country and why I think we are headed towards a civil war situation and what the elite's role in that is. So bear with me as I kind of stream of conscious my way through this. I've got some notes, but I want to give you some perspective on why I think things have begun to break down in this country. So the world has always had elites. Any society is going to have a certain number of people who, by wealth or by standing, have outsized power and control and influence. That's just the way human nature works. Even in a small group, someone ends up sort of taking charge, and you'll notice other people sort of deferring to them. So this idea that we can have a world without elites, which was the communist ideal, has always been phony. It's in our nature to sort of turn over some responsibility to others, specialize, if you will. And so I just want to start out by making the point that any society is going to have elites. That's not really the issue. The issue is what do elites believe? What do the non-elites believe about the elites? And how are elites behaving in society? So we have the oldest constitution in human history. No one's constitution has lasted as long as ours. Why haven't we had a revolution like so many other countries, including countries with democracy, with constitutions? I mean, France has had a couple of constitutions since their revolution. Why? What creates this stability in our country over 235 years in which we've never had a situation where we've had a full-on revolution and had to start again, say, with a new constitution, which is what we've seen so many other countries in the West go through over the last couple hundred years? Well, I would say we had some key ingredients. First of all, we had a lot of land. Taken from the Indians, absolutely, but this was a country founded on sort of westward expansion and all of this sort of new, soon-to-be-conquered land that Europe didn't have and that basically the rest of the known world didn't have. And it was farmable land, for a lot of it. And for a long time, at least for the first 125 years or so of the country, we were an open invitation to poor people from Western Europe to come to the United States, which was a place where they could have land, something that poor people in Europe did not have access to. The land was all owned and controlled. And here was a place where they could come and have a few acres and some autonomy and raise their family and actually own the land. Key ingredient to our early success. We had federalism, this idea of divided government and government pushed down to the lower level. So originally the concept was that the states would have the most power and the federal government would be the most powerful, but it had only a few select responsibilities. So it tended to not be as involved in people's day-to-day lives. For that, they interacted with their state, and their states, states could be different and go in different directions and experiment, and that gave people an enhanced sense of freedom because you could always pick up and move. And people did. The West was not just settled by new immigrants. The West was also settled by people in the older colonies that became states that didn't like the direction their states were going. So they packed up and they moved west to where the territories were to stake out a new claim and to have a freer existence. We also had racial and religious homogeneity. Now, when I say that, it doesn't mean that we were all racially the same or all religiously the same, but we had a dominant race, which in this case was a white race, and we also had essentially Protestantism as the dominant religion. So, of course, we had Jews and we had Catholics and we had people of other races, but you had this large majority that was racially and religiously very similar. And even among the Protestants, the differences were not so extreme as to cause people to come to the kind of blows that they do in other countries where the religious differences are so strong. And there's an argument out there that's based on our historical understanding that countries that have a dominant racial and religious majority, no matter what that racial or religious majority is, tend to be more stable than countries that have a more even mix. And we see that around the world, is the countries where it's nearly 50-50 between very different religions or very different races tend to be a lot less stable. So that we had that element for a long time. And then we had a strong sense of nationalism. There was a lot that unified people in this country for a long time. That some of those principles of freedom that we didn't see anywhere else in the world, people were coming from all over to join in on that sense of personal freedom that you could have here to speak and live that didn't exist in a lot of other places. So what is the responsibility of the elites in this society or in any society? Well, if you distill it down just to personal preservation, ultimately their job, if they want to remain elites in a society, is to make sure that stability, that general stability is there and that there's a general sense of happiness and well-being, because when that evaporates in one way or another, or for whatever reason, that you get a revolution, it's the elites that ultimately are swept away. Not that there won't be new elites down the road, but the current elites lose everything if the country or the society in question falls apart. So they're very keenly interested, obviously for selfish reasons, in making sure that there are some key ingredients to that stability in the society they oversee. Economic opportunity, decent wages, people generally need to feel safe, the laws must be fair and equal, and people need a sense, especially in our American experiment, that they have freedom within their local sphere. People who are non-elites, especially if they're down the economic scale, still must have a life that has some joys in it. I'm not suggesting that all of these things are perfect. I'm simply suggesting that elites are always keenly aware of the condition of those things I've just listed, because if they get too out of balance, if the meter runs too far in the negative, then revolution is very possible, and that can be catastrophic for the elites in any society. So one of the things I think that contributed to long-term stability in this country was that even downscale people could have a life filled with a lot of satisfaction. You know, if you were downscale in Western Europe for a long time, that meant you were a serf. In some ways, you were basically like an African-American slave in the United States, in the early years. But for a long time in this country, poor people, admittedly white people, but poor people could flood into the country and they could have a piece of land and they could have a family, and they were essentially left alone. They may only see their neighbors, attend their local church. Most people didn't travel more than 25 miles from wherever it was that they lived. And so for a long time, and without threat of invasion or Mongolian hordes coming in and killing everyone, people in America could stake out a piece of land and grow food to feed their family and raise children and have a sense of autonomy. So they may not have been very rich, but that sense of safety was there, and they could provide, and the things that family and religion provided in life, those rewards were there for them. And if you're poor, or let's say if you're not rich and so therefore you don't have access to travel and great food and all these other things, that's the kind of thing that can make a life meaningful, at least keep you out of the revolutionary realm, right? I mean, if you have access to those things, you can be quite content, and many people were. As we transitioned to industrialization and people congregated in the cities, that sense of autonomy and localized freedom began to disappear. And the whole socialist movement kicks in, and the government begins to grow in size and scope because people aren't providing for themselves and they're living a lot closer in, and people's jobs are becoming specialized. And I'm simply putting that out there as to think about the fact that a lot of the key ingredients that made our country work in the beginning have slowly been evaporating. And, our move from agrarian to industrialization is just one, and it by itself is not the catalyst, but it's part of a combination of things. And if we go back over that list, is the economic opportunity there? As elites sold us on worldwide trade, free trade, which wasn't that free, and jobs got shipped overseas, did they really look out for economic opportunity as a whole? Decent wages. The elite's fix for this is to raise minimum wage. Again, in other words, to come in with a government device to try to increase wages through either welfare payments or minimum wage. But we used to have a society that could just supply wages that a person could sustain themselves on. So the fact that they feel the need to push minimum wage laws and to hand out welfare is an indication that something's not working. And they think a government fix is going to sort of be a Band-Aid over that problem, but it cannot be. What about this idea of people's personal safety? As crime goes up, do people feel as safe as they once did? As societal norms and our sense of politeness and even as religion breaks down, and look at all sorts of petty crimes that people are involved in and just the ways, whether they're caught or not, that people offend each other. I'm not sure that we're increasing our sense of personal safety. It, of course, doesn't help to have a media environment now in which, of course, we can see every terrible thing that happens in the world. That tends to ratchet up people's sense of fear and lack of safety when they wouldn't even have known what was going on in Venezuela. 100 years ago, you would have read a little bit about it in the paper, but otherwise you wouldn't have had pictures of it beamed to you all the time. But certainly this move away from federalism has absolutely decreased people's sense of their own local freedom within their own local sphere, because everything seems to be emanating from this faraway place in Washington, D.C. There's a rule for everything, and it's coming from this faraway place that is nowhere near your local sphere, what you thought was your local sphere of freedom.
Slowly eroding freedoms.
And then lastly, on my point of it isn't just about whether elites are providing and whether or not they're looking out for the long-term stability of the country. It also is a position they hold in society. Now, if you hold that position in society, people naturally are looking up to you. And you better be giving them good reasons to look up to you. And certainly back when there was monarchies, royal families used to feel that they needed to project a certain amount of gravitas and that there was a certain amount of pomp and circumstance that brought joy into the lives of their subjects, but also they understood that they just couldn't go around doing whatever they wanted because that would engender a great deal of anger and resentment. And many kings over the years lost their heads, literally lost their heads, because they sort of fell into this idea that, well, I'm the king, I can do whatever I want, debauchery and all the rest, and soon they found their head on the chopping block. So there is a sense, there's always been a sense that elites need to project some sense of why they deserve to be the elites, and it can't just be because of inherited wealth. That's an instant path to resentment. Set a good example. Look, you need to project that you're looking out for folks. But what do people in America see now when they look at elites? They see a lot of lying, cheating, stealing. Look at what's going on with the banks and what happened in the meltdown 8 years ago. But also all the corporate cronyism, right? So we've got all of these people at the top who seem to be taking care of each other in corporations that aren't subjected to the free market. They're insulated from it, and yet they're all paying each other large salaries. That sense of cronyism, of being above the law, is an instant recipe for revolution because people feel like these are not elites that are looking out for the well-being of society. They're looking out entirely for themselves. Our elites in this country have begun to physically separate themselves. And this is not a new phenomenon, but 50, 80 years ago, rich people didn't live that far away from poor people. And a lot of, in every state there were wealthy people, and they weren't necessarily that far away from poor people. But there's been a lot of migrating going on based on the fact that we can travel now more, but that has pushed people into sort of enclaves. And you have, in these blue states especially, and on the coasts, basically around water, wealthy elite people congregating behind fences and gates and condo towers and the rest. I'll talk in the future about cloud cities and what that's all about. But you do have these sort of cloud cities forming and elites moving into them and really truly physically separating themselves with, they fly on their own planes and all the rest. And to the extent that may have always been true, certainly in our worldwide media environment, people who are downscale are much more aware of not only how wealthy people live, but that sense of separation. It doesn't seem as if elites have jobs that are obviously difficult. Where is the sacrifice that we see from elites? In the past, people who were elites often were knights or people who they were the first ones into a battle. A lot of them were killed in warfare. And an elite knew that one of his son's rite of passage was he was going to have to go and serve in war, probably lead men into battle and survive. And they didn't always survive. So there was a sense that elites understood that they needed to be first in and last out of difficult situations. And again, that would partly justify their position that they made real sacrifices. I don't think people see elites doing that in our society today. Add to that this sense of thought being punished. Even the poorest person in this country for a couple hundred years knew that he could go down to the local square and shout his mouth off. He could criticize the Vanderbilts if he wanted to, and the Vanderbilts didn't have goons that would come down and cart him away. They accepted that it's his right to say bad things about us if he wants to. Now, the public square has moved to social media, things like Facebook and Twitter and all the rest, and what's happening is the Zuckerbergs of the world are saying, it's my job to decide what's fake news, and we have to filter out the people that are saying inappropriate things. This is going on steroids over in Europe, where people who disagree with the government are being shut down. Now, when the elites are punishing thought, that's a bad sign for the future. Also, in the past, there was a healthy respect for the working class in this country, even from elites. They didn't project pity onto the working class, and they may not necessarily want to live right next to them or invite them over for dinner, but there was a healthy respect for the large number of people that are actually making the economy work. Where do you see that today? Where is there that sense from the elites in our country that they have a healthy respect for the common man or woman in this country?
You mostly see disdain, not respect.
Absolutely. So, in my mind, the lower and middle classes in any society need to have access to affordable land, or whatever the modern equivalent of that is, so they can create some sense of personal autonomy. And I see that eroding, and that's a problem. People in the lower middle classes need to be free from crushing debt. By the way, enslaving people due to their debt was a common feature of Western Europe before America came along. And again, people ran away, came to the United States to escape those kinds of debts. We have created a situation now in this country where, think of the college loans. People are being told everyone needs to go to college, and then they're coming out with these enormous loans. So you've got people in their early 20s who come out with what looks like serfdom. They have to work to pay the equivalent of a car payment every month, simply for the privilege of having gone to college, and which they were told was the only way they were going to get a good paying job. This is indentured servitude, something that we spent hundreds of years getting rid of in our society, and ultimately we thought was abolished in the United States. But it's a form of indentured servitude that we've managed to recreate. This sort of debt serfdom has come back. And as I said, this freedom of expression has eroded. Having land and having a sense of personal freedom within your own local sphere and federalism. Those are the three things that I think created the stability in this country for 200 years. And they are all deeply eroded at this point. And they are continuing to erode. And I think that's why we're beginning, we've seen a complete rejection of elites. There's this volatile anger at elites in this country. And I think everything's going in the wrong direction. as far as those trend lines. And that is ultimately why I think we are headed towards some kind of a civil war. I said in the last podcast that we're creating legions of disaffected men. Combine that with what I've just outlined about the eroding power and influence of elites in our society, and I think you have a recipe for
violence. Certainly
things that are not good. And I would say that the path that elites are on in this country is not smart. Not smart. So I saw a movie this week. I saw the new Transformers movie. Man, do I want that 2+ hours back. So I was telling Doris, about 15 minutes in, I thought, I'm cringing a lot. Maybe I can still go and get my money back. But I thought, maybe it'll improve. It did not. Folks, Transformer was awful. And it was, I think my review of it was that it was a glossy, unfunny, smarmy cringe fest. And that went on for over 2 hours. I actually, I'm not a huge fan of the Transformers movies, but I saw the first two and they were at least watchable. It was a good 2 hours of escapism, but this one was pretty bad and a waste of hundreds of millions of dollars. Very emblematic, though, of kind of where Hollywood is now. As I've said before, a lot of the interesting dramas and comedies are being done on TV now. Hollywood's very interested in doing these extremely expensive tentpole movies that they can sell worldwide. And that's fine. Most of them are just okay, but watchable. But boy, the reason I had to give this movie an F is because when I think about the amount of time and money that went in to creating this movie, which looks really good. I mean, the movie looks visually very good, but it's just soulless. That was the missing word. It's absolutely soulless movie and a complete waste of time. And it felt like somebody was making a movie, using paint by numbers, but not hitting the numbers right. So imagine if you gave a 1-year-old a paintbrush and said paint by numbers. That was sort of how this Transformer movie turned out. Just awful, and I recommend avoiding it completely.
I had enough sense not to go.
Yes, Doris is definitely smarter than I am. So this is a labor of love, but we need to grow to be able to continue bringing you this podcast. So I'm hoping that whatever app or device you're using to listen to this show, that you'll like us on that app, that you'll give us a review, and that you'll share us with your friends. Most importantly, share us with your friends. I'm happy to help my friend Mike, who would rather listen to the podcast than the voices in his head. Thank you, Mike, for listening. I've applied to get us on iTunes, and I'm hoping that we'll be up there soon. We are on SoundCloud and Stitcher and Pocket Cast. You are not alone. And we'll see you next week. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.